Okay, this screencast is not going to finish all of our notes on Chapter 23, but rather get to a stopping point right before Eisenhower. So we're going to start off talking about the Red Scare. That is what the dot game we played today is kind of foreshadowing if you didn't make the connection, but we'll talk about that more in class tomorrow. The Red Scare was the fear that communism would spread to the United States. A few things did fuel this fear, besides the fact that we're obviously getting nervous with what's happening in Eastern Europe and in Asia. There were, after World War II was over, there were thousands of Americans who were members of the Communist Party living in the United States. So these are U.S. citizens, but people who believe communism is the right way. And so the fact that Americans knew that there was a larger population than normal or than usual of communist supporters living in the country made Americans nervous. They felt they might be more loyal to the Soviet Union over the United States. And then there's also evidence that during World War II, a couple of State Department workers and federal workers had actually stolen classified information and sold it to pro-communist magazines. And then, as we'll learn about later, another thing that made people afraid during this time was that there were a couple of instances of spies working in the U.S. and passing on secret intelligence to the Soviet Union, specifically about the atomic bomb. So, now this is all going to be fueled further with McCarthyism, and hopefully by now, since you've gotten this a little bit in English class already, we know that McCarthyism is named after Republican Senator from the U.S., Joseph McCarthy. He is going to go on a large-scale communist witch hunt in our country. He will be making one unsupported accusation after another, accusing people left and right of being communists. There's really no basis with his accusations. He just wants to root out all traces of communism from the U.S. He even accuses the entire State Department, who is in charge of foreign policy, of being communists. He also would give these very passionate speeches where he claimed to have a list of names of people employed by the U.S. government working for the Communist Party, but the number always changed. In some speeches he would say he had 200 names. In some speeches he said he had 30 names. In some speeches he said he had 80 names. Kind of his rise and fall, he definitely took control of people's concerns about communism. That's the reason he even gained any attention, is Americans were fearful, so the fact that this man is making one claim after another that there are communists living in the United States makes them nervous and makes them interested, so they do kind of listen to him. But really we think now, historically, this was probably just a tactic for him to gain national attention and to gain re-election of his Senate seat. But he will eventually accuse the U.S. Army of being communist, which will lead to a federal investigation that will be televised, so the whole world's going to see it, and that means they are publicly seeing that McCarthy really doesn't have a whole lot of evidence to go by. And unfortunately, McCarthy will die a few years later after this large-scale Senate investigation, after suffering with alcoholism for some time. And if you can see this little cartoon, Mr. McCarthy began to suspect that his little cat Fluffy was indeed a communist, and that's because the cat says Mao, as in Mao Zedong, but a meow. Alright, enough with the cheesy jokes. Now on to Truman's actions. We are going to see that initially Truman was actually accused of being kind of light and soft on communism, and people want to see more action being taken. And so because he wants to respond to what people want and he cares about American public opinion, as many presidents do, he is going to pass two things. He's going to first pass the Loyalty Review Board, and this would investigate government employees and dismiss any employee who was not loyal to the U.S. government. And Truman is also going to create the House Un-American Activities Committee, which is also known as HUAC. And this committee would investigate disloyalty both in and outside of the U.S. government, which means they're not only going to be investigating government officials, but citizens themselves. Interestingly enough, HUAC is going to be conducting a large-scale investigation of the movie industry. During World War II, the movie industry produced multiple pro-Soviet films, like films that were set in the Soviet Union, films that favored the Soviet Union or shed a favorable light on them. But this is because we were aligned with them. But after World War II is over, people are going to accuse the film industry of spreading Soviet propaganda. And so HUAC wants to rid Hollywood of any kind of pro-communist influence. So they're actually going to bring many actors, producers, writers, etc. to testify in court and to kind of prove that communist ideals were presented in a positive light in movies, and basically wanting to accuse and convict those who are responsible of producing communist-friendly films. And many actors are questioned and having to give witness statements, including former President Ronald Reagan. Before he's president in the 1980s, he was a movie star, and so he's actually on. There's many videos of him being questioned in this HUAC review committee. And some actors and producers and film editors were labeled as friendly, and some were referred to as unfriendly. And these are people who actually, it wasn't that they were communists, but they felt that this was a violation of their rights as American citizens. This is unconstitutional to try to punish them for what type of films they produce. 10 witnesses from the film industry who refused to cooperate with HUAC's investigation, mainly because they felt it was unconstitutional. These 10 people in the film industry were labeled the Hollywood 10, the unfriendly who would not respond or cooperate, and they were sent to prison. And Hollywood will also respond by issuing a blacklist, essentially people who shouldn't have been hired or would be not allowed to be hired because of their ties, potential, supposed, accused ties with the communists. More Truman response is the passing of the McCarran-Walter Act. This was an immigration law that discriminated against potential immigrants from communist-dominated regions, such as Asia and Southern and Central Europe. essentially, many were convinced that the most disloyal Americans were those that had immigrated from communist-dominated parts of the world. And so there's going to be kind of limits and caps of immigrants placed on those immigrants coming into the United States. And it's no wonder why it would be Asia or southern Central Europe, because that's the satellite nations that the Soviet Union has such heavy influence over. There are two mainly known cases of spies and espionage in the United States of America. The first is Alger Hiss. In the late 1940s, Hiss was accused of passing sensitive information to the Soviet Union. Now, too much time had passed between the crime and his trial, so he couldn't have been actually charged for espionage, which is another name or word for spying. That's called, by the way, pausing, statute of limitations. When too much time has passed between when the crime was supposedly committed and when the accusation of the crime is, then the statute of limitations is up, and so you cannot accuse someone or bring them to trial on that charge. So instead he's charged with perjury, which is lying under oath, and he would be convicted and sentenced to prison. Again, he's only being convicted of perjury, but really they think he's guilty of espionage, and he claims his innocence the whole time, but later on in the 1990s, the Soviet Union does release information that does seem to prove his guilt. So it seems the United States did catch someone who was disloyal to the United States government. But the more well-known case is with Julius and Ethel, Julius is his first name, and Ethel Rosenberg, or Rosenberg, however you say. So at the very end of the 1940s, the Soviet Union had successfully made an atomic bomb. By our timeline, this was a little too fast. We did not believe that they would have been able to build it this quickly, as we were the only country to have ever successfully built one in 1945. And so we do think they must have gotten leaked information from someone in the United States that told them how to build such a weapon. And this couple, Julius and Ethel, they were members of the American Communist Party, and they were the ones officially accused of leaking the information. They were brought to trial even though they claimed their innocence. When both were put on the stand, they pleaded the fifth when asked about their involvement with communism. And pleading the fifth is your right, your amendment right to not self-accuse. There wasn't a whole lot of true evidence at the time against them, but they would be convicted and actually sentenced to death. These would be the first ever American civilians executed for espionage. We have very few notes left to take tomorrow, and that is what we will do. And I will see you tomorrow. Write down any questions, and we will discuss tomorrow afternoon.